Michael I. Neiman is an American cultural anthropologist, journalist, and media scholar who spent much of his career as a professor at SUNY Buffalo State, where he is now retired. His work focuses on countercultures, intentional communities, non-killing societies, and state responses to non-hierarchical social movements. Known especially for his long-term ethnographic research on the rainbow family, including the influential book People of the Rainbow, a Nomadic Utopia, he has contributed scholarship that blends anthropology, political ecology, and media criticism, examining how alternative communities negotiate power, conflict, and sustainability outside state structures. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, and he has been recognized for both teaching and public scholarship, maintaining a career that connects academic research, investigative reporting, and advocacy for nonviolence and cultural understanding. This 2010 chapter, You Can't Be Nonviolent Without Violence, analyses the rainbow family as a contemporary non-killing, nomadic utopian community organized around three core principles: nonviolence, non-hierarchy, and non-commercial sharing, and describes how its large, temporary autonomous zone gatherings function as intentional experiments in egalitarian living, conflict resolution, and environmental stewardship. It details how the family deliberately includes marginalized and potentially violent individuals as part of a broader healing and revitalization project, testing whether immersion in a supportive, consensus-based family can reduce antisocial behavior. The narrative then traces a decades-long pattern of confrontation between the rainbow gatherings and the U.S. Forest Service, contrasting early hands-off and cooperative approaches with later good host strategies characterized by roadblocks, health and safety pretexts, militarized policing, and a 2008 incident in which armed officers used non-lethal force in the children's camp, Kiddie Village. Through these cases, the chapter argues that state agencies repeatedly default to violent, fear-driven tactics that prove ineffective and often counterproductive, while rainbow non-violent tactics consistently de-escalate conflict and better protect people and land, thereby exposing the limits of state violence and illustrating the greater durability and efficacy of a non-killing, anarchic ban model compared to the bureaucratic state. The rainbow family began forming large outdoor gatherings in 1972, creating temporary communities that can draw tens of thousands of people into remote forests around the world. These events started in the United States but have since spread across Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Despite being informal and leaderless, the group has remained remarkably consistent in its purpose and character for more than 50 years, bringing people together to live cooperatively for short periods of time. At the heart of the rainbow family's identity are three guiding principles. The first is nonviolence, meaning members try to resolve conflicts peacefully and avoid causing harm. The second is non-hierarchy, which means there are no officials, leaders, or formal authority. Everyone participates equally. The third is non-commercial sharing, where necessities like food, medical help, and supplies are freely given rather than bought or sold. These values shape everything about how the gatherings operate. These events function as intentional communities, built from scratch and lasting only a few weeks. Participants describe them as healing spaces because they are designed to help people recover from stress, trauma, or hardship, as well as build a sense of connection. The aim is to create a welcoming environment where people from different backgrounds can come together and experience a cooperative way of living that contrasts with everyday society. The rainbow family views itself as part of a broader effort to challenge and improve mainstream culture, which they refer to as Babylon, a term they borrowed from Rastafarianism to describe societies they see as overly materialistic and conflict-driven. By stepping away from Babylon and creating their own temporary utopian communities, they hope to model a different way of life that encourages peace, equality, and mutual support. The rainbow gatherings are designed to operate as small-scale examples of how people can live together in an environmentally responsible and socially equal way. Participants build kitchens, latrines, and living areas using simple, low-impact methods, and they work to leave the land in good condition when the event ends. Everything is structured so that no one has special privileges, and everyone shares the responsibility of keeping the community running smoothly. A key part of how the gatherings function is their use of consensus decision-making. Instead of voting or relying on leaders, people talk through issues until they reach an agreement everyone can accept. Participation is voluntary, so people choose how and when to help, whether by cooking, cleaning, organizing, or providing support. This flexible and cooperative approach allows the community to operate without formal rules or authority figures. The chapter explains that these gatherings create what theorist Hakim Bey calls a temporary autonomous zone, or TAZ. This means the community exists outside the usual structures of government and commercial life for a short time, giving people a chance to imagine and experience a different kind of society. The TAS is not meant to be permanent. Its temporary nature protects it from many of the pressures and conflicts that long-term settlements face. Because the rainbow family never settles in one place for long, their movement follows what researchers call a fission fusion pattern. The group comes together to form a large community during a gathering and then breaks apart afterward, with participants dispersing until the next event. This mobility helps them avoid conflicts over territory and reduces tension with outside authorities, allowing them to maintain a peaceful and flexible way of organizing their society. The rainbow family places nonviolence at the center of its identity, treating peaceful behavior not just as a guideline but as a core expectation. Members describe themselves as part of a non-killing society, meaning they aim to avoid all forms of harm wherever possible. This commitment shapes how they interact with one another, how they organize their temporary communities, and how they respond to outside pressure, including from law enforcement. Their long history shows that they consistently try to resolve disputes without force, even when provoked. One internal debate that reflects the depth of their nonviolence is the question of eating meat. Some participants argue that killing animals for food counts as a form of violence, while others believe individual dietary choice should remain free and personal. Because the rainbow family avoids imposing strict rules, meat is never banned entirely. Instead, communal funds rarely buy meat, and many kitchens offer vegetarian or vegan meals. The fact that this debate is taken so seriously highlights how central the idea of avoiding harm is to the group's culture. Another unusual feature of the rainbow family is its willingness to include people who have histories of violence or who may be struggling with behavioral or emotional issues. Instead of excluding them to maintain peace, the group believes that offering a supportive environment can help these individuals change. They see exclusion as giving up on the possibility of nonviolence, whereas inclusion offers a chance for healing and transformation. This approach sets them apart from many intentional communities that prioritize safety by keeping out anyone who might cause trouble. Their philosophy aligns with ideas from the 19th-century anarchist thinker Peter Kropotkin, who argued that antisocial behavior can be reduced when people feel supported by a caring community. According to this view, harsh punishment or isolation tends to make problems worse, while belonging and mutual aid can help people regulate their behavior more effectively. The rainbow family has unintentionally become a living example of this theory, showing that troubled individuals often behave better when surrounded by patience, understanding, and collective responsibility. Because the gatherings bring together thousands of people without formal authority or policing, they serve as real-world testing grounds for nonviolent conflict management. Over decades, participants have developed their own methods of calming tense situations, mediating disputes, and preventing fights from escalating. These practices are constantly being refined through experience, making each gathering both a functional community and an experiment in peaceful coexistence. The result is a long-running demonstration of how nonviolent strategies can work even in large, diverse, and sometimes challenging social environments. The Rainbow family's first major clash with authorities took place at the 1972 Colorado gathering, when thousands of participants were blocked from reaching the site by police roadblocks ordered by the governor. Instead of responding with force, the group marched peacefully toward the barriers, accepting arrest if necessary. Their calm, unified approach eventually pressured officials to back down and allow the gathering to proceed. This episode set the tone for how the family would handle state interference, with large-scale, organized nonviolence. This early confrontation helped solidify civil disobedience as a defining feature of Rainbow culture. Participants came to expect that attending a gathering might involve standing up to government pressure or restrictive actions, but always through peaceful means. The willingness of thousands of people to risk arrest, not to fight, but to practice their ideals, demonstrated a collective commitment to nonviolence that became central to the movement's identity. In response to the Rainbow's peaceful behavior, the U.S. Forest Service initially adopted a relatively calm and cooperative hands-off approach. Officials often allowed the gatherings to unfold with minimal intervention, recognizing that the events were temporary and generally well managed by participants themselves. This early period showed that nonviolence could be contagious. When the Rainbow family remained peaceful and respectful, some government officials responded in kind, creating a brief window in which both sides coexisted without major conflict. In the 1980s, the government's relationship with the Rainbow family changed dramatically as federal and state authorities began treating the gatherings more like security threats than peaceful events. Law enforcement shifted toward heavier policing, watching participants closely and inserting surveillance into areas that had previously been left alone. What had once been a mostly cooperative dynamic started turning into one marked by suspicion, pressure, and aggressive oversight, even though the gatherings themselves had not fundamentally changed. Authorities increasingly relied on roadblocks, vehicle stops, and searches as a way to control movement into the sites. These stops often targeted rainbow participants specifically, amounting to profiling rather than routine policing. Many of the searches were justified as part of the war on drugs, despite evidence that the amount of drugs seized at gatherings matched what would normally be expected from any similarly sized group of travelers. For participants, this pattern of enforcement felt less like safety regulation and more like harassment designed to discourage the events altogether. This approach represented a major reversal from earlier years when cooperation and restraint had proven effective. Instead of engaging with the Rainbow family's peaceful structure, authorities began using increasingly coercive tactics, imposing restrictions, delaying supplies, and blocking essential materials. These methods not only disrupted the gatherings but also put participants at risk by interfering with basic infrastructure, such as sanitation and access roads. The breakdown of constructive dialogue pushed interactions into a more hostile and adversarial phase. The most extreme example of this shift occurred at the 1987 gathering in North Carolina, where the Forest Service implemented what it called the good host approach. In practice, this strategy involved blocking deliveries of water pipes, latrine covers, and drinking water, items essential for maintaining health and safety at a large encampment. As a result, a major outbreak of diarrhea swept through the gathering. The situation escalated into legal conflict, with the government seeking court approval to stop future gatherings, arguing they posed health and environmental dangers. A federal judge ultimately rejected the government's claims and criticized its conduct, ruling that the environmental arguments were being used in bad faith. The court found that the problems cited by the state were largely created by the government's own obstruction and hostility toward the Rainbow family. This decision acknowledged that the state had misused environmental laws as a pretext for repression and confirmed that the government's aggressive tactics, not the gatherings themselves, were responsible for many of the crises that occurred. In the late 1980s, confrontations between the Rainbow family and authorities intensified, particularly at the 1988 gathering in Texas. The Forest Service continued its aggressive good host-style enforcement, manipulating access roads in ways that increased risk rather than safety. Officials blocked a safe open road while forcing traffic onto a rough jeep trail, which allowed a drunk driver to enter the gathering and severely injure a participant known as No Guns. Remarkably, she chose not to press charges and instead forgave the driver, staying consistent with the family's nonviolent principles even after a near-fatal incident. As the gathering wore on and rainbows continued to respond peacefully to daily provocations, sympathy began to grow among local residents in conservative East Texas. When the Forest Service tried a checkmate move by blocking the only remaining access road into the site just as more people were arriving, nearby community members intervened. They brought in small fishing boats and ferried rainbow participants and supplies across Sam Houston Lake to the gathering, effectively bypassing the government blockade. This episode showed how visible nonviolence could win over local populations, even in areas that might normally be suspicious of countercultural groups. At the 1989 gathering in Nevada, federal authorities escalated further by constructing informational checkpoints along access routes, equipped with drug-sniffing dogs. Officially, these stops were meant to provide directions and safety information, but they were also used to search vehicles and make arrests when officers claimed to see probable cause. Despite the scale of the operation, very few rainbow participants were actually arrested, and the Forest Service's own reports acknowledged that the family opposed hard drugs and supported rehabilitation. Instead of reconsidering their approach, officials interpreted the low number of seizures as evidence that rainbows were sophisticated traffickers, and they expanded policing to involve a long list of federal, state, and local agencies, even though the justification for such a large law enforcement footprint was weak. Over many decades, the relationship between the Rainbow family and the government has followed a repeating cycle. Periods of relative peace and cooperation give way to sudden surges of heavy-handed policing and conflict. At times, local officials on the ground recognize that the gatherings are peaceful and choose to work with participants in a calm, practical way. But these cooperative moments rarely last, because they are repeatedly overridden by shifts in federal priorities or administrative pressure that push law enforcement back toward aggressive control and confrontation. A major factor driving this cycle is the federal law enforcement culture that surrounds the Forest Service's national leadership. Officers assigned to rainbow gatherings often receive training that emphasizes danger, tactical readiness, and worst-case scenarios rather than communication or de-escalation. This fear-based approach primes officers to expect violence even when none is present, causing them to interpret normal group behavior as a potential threat. As a result, peaceful participants are often met with militarized tactics that escalate tension unnecessarily. Behind these policies is a deep bureaucratic instinct to maintain control over any activity that falls outside normal regulatory structures. Because the Rainbow family operates without leaders, formal permits, or centralized organization, it challenges the typical command and control mindset of government agencies. Bureaucracies tend to respond to such decentralized groups by tightening enforcement, issuing more directives, and relying on force when cooperation fails to produce the obedience they expect. This creates a pattern where the state repeatedly seeks to dominate a community that is structured specifically to resist hierarchy. At a deeper level, the Rainbow family's model of voluntary cooperation, shared resources, and nonviolent self-governance acts as a quiet critique of how state power normally operates. When thousands of people demonstrate that a large, temporary community can function peacefully without police, leaders, or coercion, it indirectly questions the necessity of the state's traditional reliance on authority and force. This ideological discomfort helps explain why government responses often turn punitive. The very existence of a functioning non-hierarchical community threatens officials' assumptions about what society must look like and how order must be maintained. In 2008, a major rainbow gathering took place in Wyoming, and the U.S. Forest Service prepared for it as if they were facing a violent uprising rather than a peaceful campout. Federal officers assigned to the event received intensive, militarized training that emphasized crowd control, use of force, pepperball guns, tasers, police dogs, and hand-to-hand tactics. The curriculum focused heavily on how to strike, restrain, and subdue people, with little attention to de-escalation or nonviolent methods. This training primed officers to see the gathering as dangerous from the start and to treat normal crowds and disagreements as potential threats. Before and during the event, the government also spread an exaggerated image of the Rainbow family as violent and heavily armed. Internal messages warned officers to stay alert and claimed that participants carried hunting knives, had attacked law enforcement in the past, and brought large numbers of firearms to gatherings. These claims did not reflect the Rainbow family's long-standing reputation as a peace-focused group that rejects hard drugs and generally discourages alcohol. By framing the group as more dangerous than it really was, the authorities reinforced fear among officers and made a harsh response more likely. The most serious incident came when Forest Service law enforcement officers conducted a raid on Kiddie Village, the daycare and children's area of the gathering. Officers entered the camp in formation while chasing a man they believed had shared marijuana. When a woman approached them, witnesses say to ask them to holster their weapons, they threw her to the ground. Rainbow volunteers who acted as peacekeepers quickly formed a human barrier, linking arms and facing away from the officers while chanting Om to calm the crowd. Instead of recognizing this as a peaceful tactic, officers opened fire with pepperball guns and pointed tasers at people's faces and chests, hitting random participants as they moved through the camp. Despite being attacked, the Rainbow participants did not fight back. Peacekeepers focused on keeping everyone calm, guiding people away from the line of fire, and preventing anyone from retaliating against the officers. Over the course of the confrontation and during the officers' walk out of the forest, no law enforcement officers were injured, even though the official story later claimed that hundreds of people had been attacking them with rocks and sticks. The lack of injuries on the law enforcement side, and the absence of any armed resistance, strongly suggests that the Rainbow family's nonviolent response was effective in preventing the situation from becoming a massacre. In the months that followed, outside organizations began to unravel the official account. The American Civil Liberties Union investigated and sharply criticized the Forest Service's actions, pointing out that the evidence did not match claims of a violent mob. The Department of Agriculture's Office of Inspector General also looked into the incident. At the same time, raw video footage from the gathering, including scenes from Kiddie Village, circulated widely and showed officers firing on unarmed, non-violent people. Together, these investigations and videos made it clear that the government's description of the event was misleading and that the officers' use of force was excessive. A striking contrast emerged when comparing the behavior of federal officers with that of local sheriff's deputies who were also present at the Wyoming gathering. Local deputies, who had not received the same fear-heavy training, interacted with Rainbow participants in a more relaxed and human way. They joined prayer circles in Kiddie Village, worked with rainbow volunteers to search for a missing person, and generally treated the gathering as a community event rather than a war zone. This difference suggested that the problem was not the rainbow family itself but the mindset and training given to the federal officers. The fallout from the 2008 incident reached the upper levels of the Forest Service. John Twiss, the director in charge of law enforcement who had personally overseen operations at the gathering, resigned unexpectedly not long after the investigations and public criticism. His successor, David Farrell, moved to restrict access to information about law enforcement training, arguing that details about training programs should no longer be released under Freedom of Information requests. This push for secrecy, combined with the pattern of aggressive tactics and later denial, reinforced the chapter's broader point that federal training and bureaucratic culture around the rainbow gatherings tend to normalize violence, hide mistakes, and resist learning from the more effective nonviolent approaches that have been shown to work on the ground. The chapter argues that, over many years of encounters, the rainbow family's peaceful methods have consistently worked better than the government's use of force. Whenever conflicts arise, the rainbows respond with mediation, de-escalation, and collective calm, and these approaches reliably prevent situations from getting out of control. In contrast, moments when authorities rely on aggression, such as raids, roadblocks, and militarized policing, tend to create chaos, health risks, and public backlash rather than maintaining order. Government agencies repeatedly try to use force to compel cooperation, but these efforts almost always fall short. Heavy-handed tactics have failed to stop the gatherings, failed to gain compliance, and often created the very problems they were meant to prevent. Even in cases where thousands of peaceful participants were confronted with weapons or intimidation, the state's attempts to control the event proved ineffective because the community remained committed to nonviolent resistance. The evidence presented shows that nonviolent strategies not only reduce conflict but also keep people safer. By refusing to escalate, rainbow participants limit harm to both themselves and law enforcement officers. Their approach prevents injuries, helps maintain a sense of order in large crowds, and protects the land they use. In this way, nonviolence is shown to be both morally grounded and practically effective, outperforming the violent enforcement methods employed by the state. Underlying the repeated cycles of state repression is an institutional discomfort with what the rainbow family represents. A large functioning community with no leaders, no police, no commerce, and no coercion directly challenges the state's assumptions about how society must be organized. Its success raises questions about the necessity of hierarchical authority and violent enforcement, which makes bureaucratic systems see the gatherings not just as events to be managed, but as ideological threats. This perceived threat helps explain why agencies continue returning to force even after those tactics repeatedly fail. Over more than 40 years, the rainbow family has shown that a nonviolent, cooperative community can endure even under frequent pressure from the government. Despite having no leaders, no formal organization, and no enforcement mechanisms, the group continues to gather and function peacefully. Their ability to maintain a non-killing social structure for decades demonstrates a surprising level of resilience, especially when compared to many intentional communities or protest movements that collapse under internal conflict or outside pressure. The chapter argues that state repression is likely to continue because it follows a predictable pattern. Authorities regularly become alarmed by the rainbow family's lack of hierarchy and attempt to control or suppress the gatherings using force. When those efforts fail or cause public embarrassment, agencies temporarily pull back. Eventually, new officials repeat the cycle, returning to aggressive tactics as though the previous failures had never occurred. This pattern suggests that violent enforcement is built into the logic of state institutions, regardless of whether it works. In contrast, the rainbow family's social model is portrayed as more stable in the long run. Modern states rely on coercion, bureaucracy, and the threat of violence to maintain order, making them vulnerable to internal breakdowns, financial crises, or political upheaval. The rainbow model, flexible, voluntary, mobile, and cooperative, avoids these vulnerabilities. Because it does not depend on infrastructure, territory, or authority, it can persist even when challenged, much like earlier band-level societies that survived for millennia. The chapter closes by suggesting that non-killing, egalitarian ways of living may ultimately prove more durable than state systems built on force. While the rainbow family itself will not cause the collapse of modern governments, it may simply outlast them by relying on principles that have historically enabled human groups to survive hardship and change. In this view, the rainbow gatherings are not just a countercultural event, but a living reminder that peaceful, Decentralized societies have deep roots and may have a longer future than the coercive states that now dominate the world.